The phone rang at exactly 11:27 in the evening, just as David Kelly was staring at the ceiling of his apartment, thinking about the one person he swore he would never call again. The synchronicity was so perfect, so impossibly timed, that for a moment he wondered if the universe was playing some elaborate joke on him. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the device, and when he saw the name on the screen, his heart stopped completely. Brian Foster, the same Brian Foster he had been thinking about for the past 3 hours, replaying their last conversation over and over in his mind like a broken record. The same Brian Foster who had told him just 6 months ago that he didn't believe in signs, coincidences, or any of that spiritual nonsense that David held so dear. And yet, here he was, calling at the exact moment when David's thoughts had been consumed by memories of their shared past. David's finger hovered over the answer button, his entire body frozen in a state of disbelief. The rational part of his mind tried to dismiss it as mere chance, but something deeper, something that had been dormant for months, stirred to life in his chest. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hello," he said, and the single word carried the weight of everything unsaid between them. "David," Brian's voice came through the speaker, rough and uncertain. "I know this is crazy, but I had to call you. I've been sitting here for hours thinking about you, and I just couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to hear your voice." The words hit David like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. He closed his eyes, gripping the phone tighter as the familiar warmth of Brian's voice washed over him. It had been 6 months since they last spoke, 6 months since their friendship had imploded in a mess of unspoken feelings and miscommunication. 6 months of trying to forget the way Brian's laugh could light up an entire room, the way his presence had made David feel like he was finally home. "I was thinking about you too," David admitted, the truth spilling out before he could stop it. "Right before you called, I was lying here thinking about that night at the observatory when you said you didn't believe in signs." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and David could hear Brian's breathing, slightly uneven and uncertain. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, more vulnerable than David had ever heard it. "Maybe I was wrong about that," Brian said quietly. "Maybe I've been wrong about a lot of things. Before we see how this incredible story unfolds, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. This is one of those moments that will completely change everything between them, and you won't want to miss a single detail of what happens next. To understand how they arrived at this moment, how a simple phone call could carry such monumental weight, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to a time when David Kelly believed that love was something that happened to other people, and Brian Foster was just the charming barista at the coffee shop downtown who made the perfect cappuccino and had a smile that could stop traffic. It had started innocently enough, as these things often do. David had been a regular at Brewhaven for over a year, stopping by every morning on his way to work at the architectural firm where he spent his days designing spaces for other people to live their lives. He was a creature of habit, ordering the same drink at the same time every day, usually buried in his phone or lost in thought about whatever project was consuming his attention. Brian had been working there for 3 months when David first really noticed him, not just as the person who handed him his coffee, but as someone worth noticing. It was a Tuesday morning in October, and David had been running late after staying up too late the night before working on blueprints. He rushed into the shop, already reaching for his wallet, when Brian looked up from the espresso machine and smiled. "Rough morning," Brian had said, not really a question, but an observation delivered with such genuine warmth that David found himself pausing mid-stride. "Something like that," David had replied, surprised by the interaction. Usually their exchanges were limited to pleasantries about the weather or brief comments about the coffee. Brian had handed him his usual order, but instead of the standard paper cup, it came in a ceramic mug with a small foam heart floating on top of the cappuccino. The gesture was simple, probably something Brian did for lots of customers, but something about the way he had looked at David while sliding the mug across the counter made David's chest tighten in a way he didn't quite understand. "On the house," Brian had said with a grin. "Everyone deserves a little extra care on a Tuesday morning." That was the moment everything changed, though David wouldn't realize it until much later. That was the moment when Brian Foster stopped being just the barista and became someone who mattered, someone who could affect David's mood with nothing more than a smile and a foam heart. Over the following weeks, their morning interactions became the highlight of David's day. Brian had a way of remembering details that most people would forget, asking about the presentation David had mentioned being nervous about, or commenting on the book David was reading while waiting for his order. He was genuinely interested in David's life in a way that felt both refreshing and terrifying. David found himself lingering at the counter longer than necessary, inventing reasons to extend their conversations. He learned that Brian was 28, just 2 years younger than David himself, and that he was working at the coffee shop while finishing his degree in environmental science. He discovered that Brian had grown up in a small town about 2 hours north of the city, and that he had moved here specifically to attend the university and experience life in a bigger place. More importantly, David learned that Brian was funny in a way that caught him off guard, delivering dry observations about the morning rush customers or making clever comments about the weather that had David laughing despite himself. There was an intelligence behind Brian's easy charm, a depth that became more apparent the more time they spent talking. It was during one of these extended morning conversations that David first felt the shift in his own feelings, the moment when friendly appreciation transformed into something more dangerous. Brian had been telling him about a documentary he had watched the night before about urban planning and how it had made him think about David's work as an architect. "I bet you could design something amazing," Brian had said, leaning against the counter with his chin resting on his hand. "Something that would actually make people's lives better, not just look good in magazines." The comment had been casual, offhand, but the way Brian had looked at him while saying it, with genuine admiration and interest, had made David's heart skip in a way that was impossible to ignore. It was the first time in years that someone had seen his work as more than just a job, had understood that David actually cared about creating spaces where people could thrive. That night, David had lain awake thinking about the conversation, replaying Brian's words and the way his eyes had lit up when he talked about making a difference. It was then that David had to confront the uncomfortable truth that had been building for weeks. He was developing feelings for Brian Foster, feelings that went far beyond friendship or casual attraction. The realization terrified him. David had always been cautious when it came to relationships, preferring the safety of keeping people at arm's length rather than risking the vulnerability that came with genuine connection. He had been hurt before, badly enough that he had built walls around his heart that he thought were impenetrable. But somehow, without him even noticing, Brian had found a way through those defenses with nothing more than foam hearts in genuine conversation. For the next month, David found himself caught in an internal battle between his growing feelings and his instinct for self-preservation. He continued his morning visits to Brewhaven, but he became more guarded, more careful about how much of himself he revealed in their conversations. He told himself that what he was feeling was just a crush, something that would fade if he didn't feed it with too much attention. But Brian seemed to sense the shift in David's behavior, and instead of backing off, he became more persistent in his attempts to draw David out of his shell. He started recommending books, suggesting movies, even mentioning events around the city that he thought David might enjoy. It was during one of these recommendations that Brian first suggested they spend time together outside of the coffee shop. "There's this astronomy event at the observatory this weekend," Brian had said one Friday morning, his tone carefully casual. "They're having a special viewing of Jupiter and its moons. I know you mentioned being interested in space, so I thought maybe you'd want to check it out." David's first instinct had been to decline, to make up some excuse about being busy or not feeling well. But something in Brian's expression, a hopefulness that he was trying to hide behind his casual demeanor, made David pause. He realized that Brian was taking a risk by asking, putting himself out there in a way that required courage. "That sounds interesting," David had heard himself saying before his rational mind could intervene. "What time does it start?" The smile that had spread across Brian's face at David's acceptance was so bright, so genuinely pleased, that David felt his carefully constructed walls crumble a little more. They had made plans to meet at the observatory at 7:30 that Saturday evening, and David had spent the rest of the day alternating between excitement and panic about what he had agreed to. Saturday evening had arrived crisp and clear, perfect for stargazing. David had changed his outfit 3 times before settling on dark jeans and a sweater that he hoped struck the right balance between casual and put together. He arrived at the observatory 15 minutes early, his nerves making it impossible to sit still at home any longer. Brian had shown up exactly on time, wearing a jacket that brought out the green in his eyes and carrying a thermos that he explained contained hot chocolate spiked with a little bourbon. The gesture was thoughtful and intimate in a way that made David's chest tighten with something that felt dangerously close to affection. They had spent the evening looking through telescopes, marveling at the clarity of Jupiter's bands and the dance of its moons. Brian had been genuinely enthusiastic about the astronomy, asking intelligent questions and listening intently to the explanations provided by the observatory staff. But David found himself watching Brian more than the celestial displays, fascinated by the way his face lit up with wonder and curiosity. It was during a quiet moment, when they were standing slightly apart from the crowd and looking up at the star-filled sky with their naked eyes, that Brian had made the comment that would echo in David's mind for months to come. "I don't really believe in signs or cosmic connections or any of that stuff," Brian had said, his breath visible in the cool night air. "I think people see patterns where they wanted to see them. Like just because two things happen at the same time doesn't mean they're connected." David had felt something cold settle in his stomach at the words, though he couldn't quite articulate why they bothered him so much. Maybe it was because he had been thinking all evening about how perfect the timing of their meeting felt, how Brian had appeared in his life exactly when he needed someone to remind him that connection was possible. Maybe it was because he had been reading significance into every shared glance and casual touch, building a narrative of fate and destiny that Brian was now casually dismissing. "What about coincidences?" David had asked, trying to keep his voice light. "Don't you think some things happen for a reason?" Brian had turned to look at him then, his expression thoughtful but firm. "I think we make our own reasons," he had said. "I think we choose what matters and what doesn't, and then we convince ourselves that the universe was guiding us toward those choices all along. It's more comforting than admitting that most of life is just random chance." The words had stung more than David cared to admit, though he had nodded and smiled as if he agreed. The rest of the evening had been pleasant enough, but something had shifted between them. Some possibility that David had been nurturing had withered in the face of Brian's casual pragmatism. They had walked back to their cars together, the conversation flowing easily despite David's internal turmoil. When they reached David's car, Brian had hesitated for a moment, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. "I had a really good time tonight," Brian had said, his voice softer than usual. "I hope we can do something like this again soon." David had agreed because what else could he do? But as he drove home that night, he felt something closing off inside his chest. Brian's dismissal of signs and cosmic connections had felt like a dismissal of the very foundation upon which David had been building his feelings. How could he believe in the possibility of something meaningful between them when Brian saw their meeting as nothing more than random chance? Over the following weeks, David had found himself pulling back emotionally, even as their friendship continued to deepen on the surface. They had started spending more time together outside of the coffee shop, grabbing lunch on weekends, going to movies, exploring different neighborhoods in the city. Brian was easy company, funny and thoughtful, and genuinely interested in David's thoughts and opinions about everything from architecture to politics to the books they both enjoyed reading. But David kept Brian's words about signs and coincidences in the back of his mind like a protective barrier, a reminder not to read too much into the way Brian's hand would brush against his when they walked side by side, or the way Brian's eyes would linger on his face when he thought David wasn't looking. He told himself that Brian was just naturally affectionate, naturally warm, and that any romantic undertones David perceived were simply projections of his own wishful thinking. The irony was that the more time they spent together, the deeper David's feelings became. Brian was everything David had never known he wanted in a partner. He was intelligent without being condescending, passionate about his environmental work without being preachy, and had a way of making David feel seen and appreciated that was both thrilling and terrifying. There were moments when David was certain that Brian felt something too. Moments when their conversations would drift into territory that felt distinctly intimate, when Brian would share details about his past relationships or his fears about the future that felt like confidences meant only for David. There were touches that lasted a beat too long, glances that seemed to carry more weight than casual friendship could account for. But every time David found himself on the verge of believing that something real might be developing between them, he would remember Brian's words about signs and coincidences, and he would pull back, afraid of misinterpreting friendship for something more significant. The situation had come to a head on a rainy Thursday evening in March, almost 5 months after their first trip to the observatory. They had been at David's apartment, ostensibly to work on a project that Brian needed help with for one of his environmental science classes. David had offered to help with the architectural aspects of Brian's proposal for sustainable urban development, and they had spent several hours spread out on David's living room floor, surrounded by papers and laptops and empty coffee cups. The work had gone well, with David contributing ideas about building design and space utilization that had made Brian's eyes light up with excitement. There had been something deeply satisfying about collaborating with Brian, about combining their different areas of expertise to create something better than either of them could have produced alone. As the evening had worn on, their conversation had drifted away from the project and toward more personal topics. Brian had been telling David about his childhood, about growing up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and how liberating it had been to move to the city where he could reinvent himself. "I think that's part of why I don't believe in fate or destiny," Brian had said, lying on his back on the carpet with his hands behind his head. "In a small town, it feels like your whole life is predetermined, you know? Like you're supposed to marry your high school sweetheart and take over your father's business and never question whether that's actually what you want." David had been sitting cross-legged nearby, watching the way the lamplight played across Brian's features as he spoke. There was something vulnerable in Brian's tone, something that suggested this wasn't just casual philosophy, but a deeply held belief born from personal experience. "So you came here to escape all that," David had said, not really a question. Brian had turned his head to look at David, his expression serious. "I came here to choose my own life," he had said, "to make decisions based on what I actually want, not what other people expect, or what seems like the obvious path." The words had hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that David wasn't sure he was interpreting correctly. There had been something in the way Brian was looking at him, something that felt like an invitation or a challenge. But David had been too afraid of misreading the situation to respond. Instead, he had changed the subject, asking Brian about his plans for graduation and what kind of job he hoped to find in environmental consulting. The moment had passed, but David had felt its weight for the rest of the evening, wondering if he had missed an opportunity for something important. The evening had ended with Brian gathering up his papers and thanking David for his help with the project. They had stood at David's front door, Brian's jacket in his hands, neither of them seeming eager to end the night despite the late hour. "I really appreciate this," Brian had said, gesturing toward the folder containing their collaborative work. "You didn't have to spend your whole evening helping me, but you did, and it means a lot." David had felt his heart squeeze at the sincerity in Brian's voice. It was nothing, he had said, though they both knew that wasn't true. The hours they had spent working together had felt like some of the most natural and comfortable time David had ever experienced with another person. Brian had stepped closer then, close enough that David could smell his cologne and see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. For a moment, it had seemed like Brian might say something else, something that would change the nature of their relationship forever. But instead, he had simply reached out and squeezed David's shoulder, his hand lingering for just a beat longer than casual friendship would dictate. "I'll see you tomorrow morning," Brian had said, his voice softer than usual. Same time, same place. David had nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and had watched Brian walk down the hallway toward the elevator. He had stood in his doorway until he heard the elevator doors close, his shoulders still warm from Brian's touch, his mind racing with everything that had been said and left unsaid during the evening. That night, David had lain awake for hours, replaying every moment of their interaction and trying to decode the meaning behind Brian's words and gestures. He had felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that one wrong step could destroy the friendship that had become so important to him, but also knowing that staying where he was meant never discovering what might be possible between them. The next morning had arrived gray and drizzling, matching David's mood as he made his way to Brewhaven for his usual coffee. He had spent the night oscillating between hope and fear. building up the courage to say something to Brian about his feelings, then talking himself out of it again. When he had walked into the coffee shop, Brian had been behind the counter as usual, but something had been different about his demeanor. He had seemed distracted, less focused on their conversation than usual, and when he had handed David his coffee, their usual easy banter had felt forced and awkward. David had attributed it to his own nervousness at first, assuming that his internal turmoil was affecting his ability to read the situation clearly. But as the days had passed, the awkwardness between them had only intensified. Brian had become increasingly distant, their conversations shorter and more superficial, until David had begun to wonder if he had somehow misstepped during their evening working together. The situation had reached its breaking point the following week when David had arrived at Brewhaven to find Brian in deep conversation with a woman he didn't recognize. She was tall and blonde, with a kind of effortless beauty that made David feel instantly inadequate. More importantly, she was touching Brian's arm as they talked, leaning in close in a way that spoke of intimacy and familiarity. David had felt something cold and sharp twist in his chest as he watched them together. The woman had been laughing at something Brian had said, her head thrown back in genuine amusement, and Brian had been looking at her with an expression of fond affection that David had thought was reserved for him alone. He had almost turned around and left without ordering, but Brian had spotted him before he could make his escape. The smile that had spread across Brian's face had been bright but somehow different, lacking the warmth and genuine pleasure that David had grown accustomed to seeing there. "David," Brian had called out, gesturing him over to the counter. "Come meet Patricia. Patricia, this is David, the architect I was telling you about." Patricia Williams had turned to face David with a smile that was friendly but assessing, extending her hand for a shake that was firm and confident. "It's so nice to finally meet you," she had said. "Brian talks about you all the time." The words had been meant as a compliment, David was sure, but they had felt like a knife twisting in his chest. The idea that Brian had been discussing him with this woman, this beautiful woman who was clearly more than just a casual acquaintance, had made David feel exposed and foolish. He had managed to exchange pleasantries with Patricia, learning that she was a graduate student in Brian's program and that they had been working together on a research project about urban sustainability. She had been an intelligent and articulate, discussing their work with a passion that matched Brian's own, and David had realized with growing dismay that she was exactly the kind of person Brian should be with. The conversation had been brief, as Patricia had needed to leave for a class, but not before she had kissed Brian goodbye on the cheek and made plans to meet him later that evening for dinner. David had watched the interaction with a sick feeling in his stomach, finally understanding why Brian had seemed so distracted lately. After Patricia had left, Brian had turned back to David with an expression that seemed almost apologetic, though David couldn't understand why. The usual easy conversation between them had been replaced by an awkward silence that neither of them seemed able to break. "So," David had finally said, forcing his voice to sound casual, "she seems nice." Brian had nodded, his hands busy with unnecessary tasks behind the counter. "She is," he had said. "We've been spending a lot of time together lately, working on this project. She's really brilliant, actually. Has all these ideas about sustainable development that I never would have thought of." David had felt each word like a physical blow, but he had managed to keep his expression neutral. "That's great," he had said. "It's good that you found someone who shares your interests." The conversation had limped along for a few more minutes before David had made his excuses and left, his coffee growing cold in his hands as he walked back to his office. He had spent the rest of the day in a haze of misery and self-recrimination, berating himself for ever thinking that Brian might see him as more than just a friend. Over the following weeks, David had watched from a distance as Brian's relationship with Patricia had developed. They had become a regular sight at the coffee shop, Patricia often stopping by between classes to study or meet Brian during his breaks. She had always been friendly to David when their paths crossed, but there had been something in her manner that suggested she was aware of his feelings for Brian, a subtle possessiveness that made David feel like an intruder in what had once been his space. The worst part had been watching Brian with her, seeing the way his face lit up when she walked into the room, the way he would unconsciously lean toward her when they talked. It had been everything David had hoped to see directed at him, and witnessing it given to someone else had been almost unbearable. David had begun to avoid Brewhaven, finding excuses to get his coffee elsewhere, or skip it altogether. When he did have to go there for some reason, he had kept his interactions with Brian brief and professional, no longer lingering at the counter for extended conversations. Brian had seemed to notice the change in David's behavior, making several attempts to engage him in their old easy banter. But David had been too raw, too afraid of revealing his feelings, to respond naturally. The friendship that had once been the brightest part of his day had become a source of pain that he couldn't figure out how to navigate. The final confrontation had come on a warm evening in late April. David had been walking home from work, taking a longer route to avoid passing by Brewhaven, when he had spotted Brian sitting alone on a bench in the small park near David's apartment building. He had looked upset, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by something that looked like confusion and frustration. David's first instinct had been to keep walking, to avoid what would undoubtedly be an awkward encounter. But something about Brian's posture, the way he was hunched over with his head in his hands, had made David pause. Despite everything that had happened between them, despite his own hurt feelings, he couldn't just walk away when Brian was clearly in distress. Brian had looked up as David approached, his expression cycling through surprise, relief, and something that might have been guilt. "David," he had said, his voice rough with emotion, "I was hoping I'd run into you." David had sat down on the bench beside him, careful to leave enough space between them that they wouldn't accidentally touch. "You look like you've had a rough day," he had said, falling back into the easy concern that had always characterized their friendship. Brian had laughed, but there had been no humor in the sound. "You could say that," he had said. "Patricia and I broke up this afternoon." David had felt a complex mixture of emotions at the news. Relief, certainly, and a shameful flicker of hope, but also genuine concern for Brian's obvious pain. He had wanted to ask what had happened, but something in Brian's expression had warned him away from the topic. "I'm sorry," David had said instead, and he had meant it. He might have been harboring feelings for Brian, but that didn't mean he wanted to see him hurt. Brian had turned to look at him then, his green eyes searching David's face as if looking for something specific. "Are you?" he had asked quietly. "Sorry, because you've been avoiding me for weeks, and I can't figure out why." The directness of the question had caught David off guard. He had opened his mouth to deny it, to make up some excuse about being busy at work, but the words had stuck in his throat. There had been something so vulnerable about the way Brian was looking at him, something that demanded honesty even when the truth felt dangerous. "I have been avoiding you," David had admitted finally, "but not for the reasons you probably think." Brian had shifted on the bench to face him more fully, his expression intent. "Then tell me what the real reasons are," he had said, "because I've been going crazy trying to figure out what I did wrong." The words had hung in the air between them, and David had realized that this was the moment he had been both dreading and hoping for. The moment when he would have to choose between protecting himself and risking everything for the possibility of something real. "You didn't do anything wrong," David had said slowly. "The problem is me and the way I feel about you." Brian had gone very still, his eyes never leaving David's face. "What way is that?" he had asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David had taken a deep breath, knowing that once he said the word, there would be no taking them back. "I'm in love with you," he had said simply. "I have been for months, and watching you with Patricia was killing me, so I thought it would be easier to just stay away." The silence that had followed had seemed to stretch on forever. Brian had stared at him with an expression that David couldn't read, cycling through what looked like surprise, confusion, and something that might have been fear. David had felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited for Brian's response, prepared for rejection, but hoping against hope for something else. When Brian had finally spoken, his voice had been quiet and uncertain. "I had no idea," he had said. I wondered sometimes, but I convinced myself I was imagining things." David had felt something cold settle in his stomach. "And now that you know," he had said, trying to keep his voice steady, "how do you feel about it?" Brian had been quiet for a long moment, his gaze focused on his hands clasped in his lap. "I don't know," he had said finally. "This is all really confusing for me, David. I've never thought about another man that way before." The words had been like a physical blow, confirming David's worst fears about the impossibility of the situation. He had started to stand up, ready to make his excuses and escape before he embarrassed himself further, But Brian had reached out and caught his wrist. "Wait," Brian had said urgently. "Please don't leave. I'm not saying no, I'm just saying I need time to think about this." David had looked down at Brian's hand on his wrist, at the way his fingers were wrapped around David's arm, like he was afraid David might disappear. There had been something desperate in Brian's touch, something that spoke of confusion and possibility in equal measure. "I understand if this is too much," David had said carefully. "I never meant to put you in an uncomfortable position." Brian had shaken his head, his grip on David's wrist tightening slightly. "You didn't," he had said. "That's not what this is about. It's just that I've been so confused lately about a lot of things. My relationship with Patricia never felt right, but I couldn't figure out why. And then there's the way I feel when I'm with you, which is different from anything I've experienced before." David had felt his heart skip at the admission, hope blooming in his chest despite his attempts to keep his expectations in check. "Different how?" he had asked. Brian had looked up at him then, his expression raw and vulnerable. "Like I can finally breathe," he had said quietly. "Like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The words had been everything David had dreamed of hearing, but they had also been terrifying in their implications. If Brian was questioning his sexuality, if he was having feelings for David that he didn't understand, then they were both entering uncharted territory that could either lead to something beautiful or destroy them both. They had talked for another hour sitting on that bench as the sun set around them and the park gradually emptied of other people. Brian had been honest about his confusion, about the way his feelings for David had been growing even as he tried to make things work with Patricia. He had admitted that he had been thinking about David constantly, comparing every interaction with Patricia to the easy intimacy he shared with David and finding Patricia lacking. David had listened with a mixture of hope and fear, wanting to believe that Brian's feelings were real, but terrified of the possibility that this was just experimentation, a phase that Brian would move past once the novelty wore off. He had shared his own fears about their friendship, about how much Brian meant to him, and how afraid he was of losing that connection if they tried to be something more and failed. The conversation had ended with Brian asking for time to sort through his feelings, and David agreeing to give him the space he needed. They had parted that night with a careful hug that had lasted just a moment too long, and David had walked home with his heart full of cautious hope and terrified anticipation. The next few weeks had been some of the most difficult of David's life. Brian had stopped coming to work at Brewhaven, having given his notice to focus on finishing his degree, which meant that David had no casual way to check on him or gauge how he was processing their conversation. They had exchanged a few text messages, brief and carefully neutral, but nothing that gave David any insight into what Brian was thinking or feeling. David had thrown himself into work, staying late at the office and taking on extra projects to keep his mind occupied. But no matter how busy he kept himself, he couldn't stop thinking about Brian, replaying their conversation in the park and wondering if he had made a terrible mistake by being honest about his feelings. It had been during one of these late nights at the office, almost 3 weeks after their conversation in the park, that David had received a text from Brian asking if they could meet. The message had been simple and direct, giving no indication of what Brian wanted to discuss, but David's heart had raced as he typed back his agreement. They had met at a small cafe across town, neutral territory that held no memories of their friendship or the complicated feelings that had developed between them. Brian had been waiting when David arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee already ordered, his expression serious, but not unkind. David had slid into the seat across from him, his hands trembling slightly as he wrapped them around the warm mug. Brian had looked tired, like he hadn't been sleeping well, but there had been something resolved in his expression that hadn't been there during their last conversation. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Brian had said without preamble, "about what you said, about how I feel, about what I want my life to look like." David had nodded, not trusting himself to speak, his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited for Brian to continue. "I think you were right about signs and coincidences," Brian had said, his voice quiet but steady. "I think maybe the universe does put people in our lives for a reason, even if we're too stubborn or scared to see it at first." The words had sent a shock of hope through David's system, but he had forced himself to remain calm, to wait for Brian to explain what he meant. I realize that every relationship I've ever had has felt like I was playing a role, Brian had continued. Like I was trying to be the person I thought I was supposed to be, rather than the person I actually am. But with you, I never felt like I had to pretend to be anyone else. David had felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, but he had blinked them back, not wanting to interrupt Brian's explanation. I don't know what this makes me, Brian had said, his voice growing more uncertain. I don't know if I'm gay or bisexual or just David sexual, but I know that I care about you more than I've ever cared about anyone, and I know that I want to explore what this could be between us. The words had been everything David had hoped to hear, but they had also been terrifying in their honesty and vulnerability. He had reached across the table and taken Brian's hand, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that felt both natural and momentous. Are you sure? David had asked quietly. Because once we cross this line, there's no going back to the way things were before. Brian had squeezed his hand, his eyes meeting David's with an intensity that took David's breath away. I'm sure, he had said. I'm terrified, but I'm sure. They had left the cafe together, walking slowly through the city streets as they talked about what this meant for them, what they wanted to try, how they would navigate the uncertainty of Brian's evolving understanding of his sexuality. It had been a conversation full of hope and fear in equal measure, but underneath it all had been a sense of rightness, of two people finally acknowledging what had been building between them for months. That night had marked the beginning of something beautiful and complicated and entirely new for both of them. Brian had been true to his word about wanting to explore their connection, approaching their relationship with the same thoughtful intensity he brought to everything else in his life. The first few weeks had been a careful dance of discovery, both of them learning how to be together in this new way while preserving the friendship that had been the foundation of their connection. Brian had been honest about his uncertainty, about the moments when he questioned whether his feelings were real or just a response to the emotional intimacy they had always shared. But those doubts had faded as they spent more time together, as Brian experienced the difference between the forced compatibility he had felt with Patricia and the natural ease of being with David. Their first kiss had happened 3 weeks into their relationship, a soft and tentative exploration that had left them both breathless and certain that they were on the right path. David had been patient with Brian's process of self-discovery, understanding that coming to terms with a new understanding of his sexuality was something that couldn't be rushed. He had been there for the moments of doubt and confusion, providing reassurance and support without pressure or judgment. In return, Brian had brought a joy and lightness to David's life that he had never experienced before. Brian's natural optimism and enthusiasm had helped David see the world through new eyes, finding wonder and possibility in places he had never thought to look. Their relationship had deepened over the summer months, moving from tentative exploration to genuine partnership. They had navigated the challenges of Brian's coming out process together, supporting each other through difficult conversations with family and friends, and celebrating the moments of acceptance and understanding. By the time fall arrived, they had settled into a rhythm that felt both exciting and comfortable. Brian had graduated and found a job with an environmental consulting firm that specialized in sustainable urban development, work that he loved and that allowed him to use the skills he had developed in school. David had been promoted to senior architect at his firm, finally getting the opportunity to work on projects that aligned with his values and interests. Having Brian's support and encouragement had given him the confidence to pursue the kind of meaningful work he had always wanted to do. Everything had been perfect, or as close to perfect as real life ever gets, which was why the fight they had in September had been so devastating, coming as it did out of nowhere and threatening to destroy everything they had built together. It had started with something small, a disagreement about weekend plans that had somehow escalated into a full-blown argument about commitment in the future. Brian had accused David of being afraid to fully invest in their relationship, of keeping one foot out the door in case things went wrong. David had responded by accusing Brian of being naive about the challenges they would face as a same-sex couple, of not understanding the reality of what they were choosing. The fight had been brutal and exhausting, touching on every insecurity and fear they had both been harboring. It had ended with Brian storming out of David's apartment, leaving David alone with a terrible certainty that he had just destroyed the best thing that had ever happened to him. They hadn't spoken for 6 months. 6 months of David replaying every moment of their relationship, wondering if Brian had been right about his commitment issues, if he had sabotaged their happiness out of fear. 6 months of missing Brian with an intensity that sometimes made it hard to breathe, of seeing reminders of him everywhere, and feeling the loss like a physical ache. David had thrown himself into work again, but this time it had felt different. The projects that had once excited him now felt hollow and meaningless without Brian to share them with. He had tried dating other people, but every interaction had felt forced and artificial compared to the natural connection he had shared with Brian. He had spent countless nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling and thinking about calling Brian. But his pride and fear had always stopped him. He had convinced himself that Brian was better off without him, that Brian deserved someone who could love him without reservation or fear. But tonight, lying in his bed and thinking about all the ways he had failed to appreciate what they had together, David had finally admitted to himself that he had been wrong about everything. Wrong about signs and coincidences, wrong about his own capacity for commitment, wrong about what Brian needed from him. He had been thinking about that night at the observatory, about Brian's dismissal of cosmic connections and signs from the universe. He had been remembering the way Brian's face had looked in the starlight, the way he had spoken about making his own choices and creating his own meaning. And David had realized that maybe Brian had been right about that too, that maybe the most meaningful connections were the ones you chose to nurture and protect, regardless of how they began. He had been thinking about calling Brian, working up the courage to swallow his pride and admit that he had been wrong about so many things. He had been rehearsing what he would say, how he would apologize for his fear and his stubbornness and his failure to fight for what they had together. And then the phone had rung, and Brian's name had appeared on the screen, and David had felt the universe shift around him in a way that made him believe in kinds of synchronicity and all the cosmic forces that Brian had once dismissed. Now, sitting in his bed with the phone pressed to his ear and Brian's voice washing over him like a balm for his wounded heart, David felt something that had been broken inside him begin to heal. "I've missed you," David said quietly, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "Every single day for 6 months, I've missed you." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, and when Brian spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I've missed you too," he said, "so much that sometimes I felt like I couldn't breathe." They talked for 3 hours that night, working through the hurt and anger and misunderstanding that had driven them apart. Brian admitted that he had been scared too, scared of how much he loved David and how completely his life had changed since they had been together. He had lashed out during their fight because he had been afraid that David's fears were justified, that they were doomed to failure because of the challenges they would face. David apologized for his cowardice, for allowing his fear of loss to prevent him from fully embracing what they had together. He admitted that he had been so afraid of getting hurt that he had hurt them both instead, pushing Brian away before Brian could leave him. They talked about the months they had spent apart, about the loneliness and regret, and the way they had both tried to convince themselves that they were better off without each other. They laughed about the irony of Brian calling at the exact moment David had been thinking about him, about the cosmic joke of two people who didn't believe in signs being brought together by the most obvious sign imaginable. As the conversation wound down, they made tentative plans to meet for coffee the next day, to continue the conversation in person and see if they could find a way back to each other. David felt a cautious hope blooming in his chest, tempered by the knowledge that they still had work to do to rebuild the trust they had damaged. But when Brian said goodnight, his voice soft and full of affection, David felt something settle into place inside him that had been displaced for far too long. Maybe they couldn't go back to the way things were before, but maybe they could build something even better, something stronger for having survived the test of separation and loss. The next morning, David arrived at their agreed-upon meeting place 15 minutes early, his nerves making it impossible to sit still at home. It was a different cafe from the one where they had first talked about their feelings, a neutral space with no history to complicate their fresh start. Brian arrived exactly on time, and David's breath caught in his throat at the sight of him. 6 months had changed him slightly, had added lines of stress around his eyes and a wariness to his expression that hadn't been there before. But he was still beautiful, still the person who could make David's heart race with nothing more than a smile. They ordered their drinks and found a quiet table in the corner, both of them seeming uncertain about how to begin this conversation. The easy intimacy they had once shared felt fragile now, something that would need to be rebuilt slowly and carefully. "I wasn't sure you would come," Brian said finally, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug as if seeking warmth. David reached across the table and covered one of Brian's hands with his own, feeling a shock of recognition at the familiar warmth of his skin. "I wasn't sure either," he admitted, "but I realized last night that I'd rather risk getting hurt again than spend another day without you in my life." Brian's eyes filled with tears at the words, and he turned his hand palm up so that their fingers could intertwine. "I love you," he said quietly. "I never stopped loving you, even when I was angry and hurt and convinced that we were impossible." "I love you too," David replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "And I want to try again, if you're willing. I want to do it right this time." They spent the rest of the morning talking through their fears and hopes, making plans for how they would approach their relationship differently this time. They agreed to be more honest about their insecurities, to communicate better when problems arose, to fight for each other instead of against each other when challenges appeared. It wasn't easy, rebuilding what they had lost. There were moments of awkwardness and uncertainty, times when the hurt they had caused each other rose to the surface and threatened to derail their progress. But they were both committed to making it work, both willing to do the hard work of healing and forgiveness. Slowly, over the course of several weeks, they found their way back to each other. The first time Brian stayed over at David's apartment again, they had lain awake talking until dawn, relearning the rhythm of each other's breathing and the comfort of shared space. The first time they kissed again, it had felt like coming home after a long and difficult journey. By the time winter arrived, they had settled into a new normal that was both familiar and different from their previous relationship. They were more careful with each other now, more intentional about protecting what they had built. But they were also more honest, more willing to be vulnerable and ask for what they needed. Brian had been right about signs and coincidences, David realized. The universe hadn't brought them together or torn them apart or reunited them. They had done all of that themselves through their choices and their fears and their willingness to fight for something worth having. But maybe that made it more meaningful, not less. Maybe the fact that they had chosen each other again and again, despite the obstacles and setbacks, was more powerful than any cosmic intervention could have been. David thought about this as he watched Brian sleeping beside him on a quiet Sunday morning in December, almost a year after their reunion phone call. Brian's face was peaceful in sleep, younger looking without the intensity that usually animated his features. David felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it almost took his breath away, grateful for second chances and forgiveness and the stubborn persistence of love. Brian stirred as if sensing David's attention, his eyes fluttering open to meet David's gaze. "Morning," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep but warm with affection. "Morning," David replied, leaning down to press a soft kiss to Brian's forehead. "I was just thinking about that night you called me." Brian smiled, the expression transforming his face with its brightness. "Best coincidence of my life," he said, then paused and corrected himself. "Best choice of my life." David laughed, remembering their old argument about signs versus choice. "I think maybe it was both," he said. "The coincidence gave us the opportunity, but we chose what to do with it." Brian reached up and cupped David's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across David's cheekbones. "I choose you," he said seriously. "Every day, in every way that matters, I choose you." David felt his heart swell with love and certainty. "And I choose you," he replied, "always." They lay there for a while longer, wrapped in the warmth of their bed and their love, watching the winter sunlight creep across the walls of their shared apartment. It was a quiet moment, unremarkable in many ways, but David treasured it as he treasured all their quiet moments now. He had learned not to take them for granted, had learned that love was built from an accumulation of small choices and daily kindnesses, rather than grand gestures and cosmic interventions. Eventually, they got up and made breakfast together, moving around each other in the kitchen with the easy choreography of long familiarity. Brian made coffee while David scrambled eggs, and they ate at the small table by the window, reading sections of the newspaper aloud to each other and planning their day. It was ordinary and domestic and perfect in its simplicity. David thought about his younger self, the man who had been so afraid of commitment and vulnerability that he had nearly thrown away the best thing that had ever happened to him. That David would have been terrified by this level of domestic intimacy, would have seen it as a trap rather than a gift. But this David, the one who had learned the hard way that love was worth fighting for, treasured every mundane moment. He treasured the way Brian hummed while he cooked, the way he left books open on every surface, the way he always remembered to buy David's favorite coffee even when he was rushing. He treasured the way they had learned to fight better, to address problems before they became crises, to support each other through stress and uncertainty. He treasured the way Brian had grown more confident in his identity over the past year, no longer questioning whether his feelings were real or valid, but embracing them as an integral part of who he was. Most of all, he treasured the way they had both learned to choose love over fear, to trust in what they had built together rather than waiting for external forces to tear it apart. After breakfast, they decided to take a walk through the city, bundled up against the December cold, but eager to get outside and enjoy the crisp winter air. They walked hand in hand through the streets where they had first gotten to know each other, past the coffee shop where Brian had once worked, past the park where they had first confessed their feelings. Everything looked different now, transformed by the lens of their shared history and the knowledge of how much they had overcome to be together. The city that had once felt vast and anonymous now felt like home, filled with memories and meaning that they had created together. They ended up at the observatory where they had gone on their first unofficial date, the place where Brian had first expressed his skepticism about signs and cosmic connections. It was closed for renovations, but they stood outside looking up at the winter sky, remembering that night and how much had changed since then. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't met?" Brian asked, his breath visible in the cold air. David considered the question seriously. "I think we would have found each other eventually," he said. "Maybe not in the same way, but somehow, some people are just meant to be in each other's lives." Brian smiled at that, squeezing David's hand tighter. "Even if you don't believe in cosmic intervention." "Especially then," David replied, "because it means we didn't just get lucky. It means we recognized something worth fighting for and chose to fight for it." They stood there for a while longer, two men who had learned that love was both simpler and more complicated than either of them had imagined. Simpler because at its core it was just a choice made over and over again, a commitment to seeing and supporting each other through all of life's changes and challenges. More complicated because that choice had to be made consciously and consistently, even when it was difficult, even when fear tried to convince them that safety lay in distance rather than closeness. As they walked home, David thought about the phone call that had changed everything, the moment when synchronicity and choice had aligned to give them a second chance. He thought about all the small moments that had led up to that call, all the tiny decisions and coincidences that had woven their lives together in ways neither of them could have predicted. Maybe Brian had been right that people saw patterns where they wanted to see them. Maybe the universe wasn't actively conspiring to bring soulmates together or tear them apart. But maybe that didn't matter. Maybe what mattered was recognizing love when it appeared in your life and having the courage to nurture it, to protect it, to choose it again and again, regardless of how it had arrived. That evening, as they settled in for a quiet night at home, David found himself thinking about the future in a way he hadn't allowed himself to do during their first time together. He thought about the apartment they were planning to look for together, something bigger with space for both of their books and Brian's ever-expanding collection of plants. He thought about the vacation they were planning for the spring, a trip to the small town where Brian had grown up so that David could meet his parents and see the place that had shaped the man he loved. He thought about the conversation they had started having about marriage, about making their commitment official in the eyes of the law in their community. It was still early, still tentative, but the fact that they could talk about it at all felt like a miracle after the months of separation and uncertainty. Most of all, he thought about growing old with Brian, about building a life together that was based on choice rather than chance, on daily acts of love rather than grand romantic gestures. It was a quieter kind of love story than the one he had imagined for himself when he was younger. But it was also deeper and more sustainable, built on a foundation of friendship and mutual respect that could weather whatever storms life might bring. As they got ready for bed, Brian caught David's eye in the bathroom mirror, and smiled, the expression soft and content. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, recognizing the contemplative look on David's face. "Just this," David replied, gesturing at the ordinary domestic scene around them. "Us. How lucky we are to have found each other." Brian turned to face him, reaching up to straighten the collar of David's pajama shirt in a gesture that was both intimate and unconscious. "We make our own luck," he said, echoing his old philosophy, but with a warmth that transformed its meaning. David nodded, understanding now what Brian had been trying to tell him all those months ago at the observatory. They hadn't been brought together by fate or cosmic intervention. They had found each other through a series of small choices and random encounters, had built their love through daily decisions to be vulnerable and honest and present for each other. But that didn't make their love any less meaningful or miraculous. If anything, it made it more precious, because it was something they had created together rather than something that had been given to them by external forces. That night, as they lay in bed with Brian's head on David's shoulder and their legs tangled together under the covers, David felt a peace and contentment that he had never experienced before. He thought about the phone call that had started their reconciliation, about the perfect timing that had seemed so significant at the time. Now he understood that the timing hadn't been the important part. The important part had been that they had both been brave enough to reach out, to admit their mistakes and their longing for each other. The important part had been their willingness to try again, to do the hard work of rebuilding trust and intimacy. The phone call had been just the beginning, the first step in a journey that was still ongoing. Every day they chose each other was another step, another small victory over fear and doubt, and the human tendency to protect oneself at the expense of connection. David pressed a kiss to the top of Brian's head, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo and feeling grateful for all of it. The coincidence that had brought them together, the choices that had kept them together, the love that had survived separation and grown stronger for having been tested. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to choose love over fear, to support each other through whatever life might bring. But tonight they were together and safe and home, and that was enough. That was everything. As David drifted off to sleep, he thought one more time about signs and coincidences and the mysterious ways that people found each other in a vast and complicated world. Maybe Brian had been right that they created their own meaning, that love was something you built rather than something that happened to you. But maybe that was the most beautiful part of all. Maybe the fact that they had chosen each other consciously and deliberately and against all odds was more romantic than any story about destiny or fate could ever be. In the months that followed, their relationship continued to deepen and evolve in ways that surprised them both. They learned to navigate the challenges of truly sharing a life together, from the mundane negotiations about household chores and finances to the deeper work of supporting each other through career changes and family drama. Brian's parents had initially struggled with his relationship with David, not out of malice but out of confusion and concern for their son's happiness. It had taken several visits and many patient conversations before they began to understand that Brian's love for David wasn't a phase or a rebellion, but a genuine and lasting connection that had brought joy and stability to their son's life. David's own family had been more immediately accepting, perhaps because they had watched him struggle through years of unsatisfying relationships and could see how much happier he was with Brian. His sister had particularly taken to Brian, appreciating his environmental work and his ability to make David laugh in ways she hadn't seen since they were children. The process of coming out to extended family and colleagues had been ongoing and sometimes difficult, but it had also been liberating in ways neither of them had anticipated. Living openly as a couple had freed them from the exhausting work of hiding or downplaying their relationship, allowing them to simply be themselves in all areas of their lives. Their careers had both flourished as well. Brian had been promoted to senior consultant at his firm, leading projects that were making real differences in urban sustainability. David had started his own architectural practice with a focus on affordable housing and community development, work that felt meaningful and aligned with his values. They had supported each other through the stresses and uncertainties of these professional changes, celebrating successes together and providing comfort during setbacks. Having a true partner, someone who understood the pressures and rewards of meaningful work, had made both of them more confident and effective in their careers. But it was the small, daily moments that David treasured most. The way Brian would leave little notes in his lunch when he was working on a particularly stressful project. The way they had developed their own shorthand for communication, able to convey complex thoughts and feelings with just a look or a touch. The way they had learned to give each other space when needed while still maintaining their connection. They had also learned to fight better, to address conflicts when they were small, rather than letting them fester into relationship-threatening arguments. They had established rules for difficult conversations, agreeing to take breaks when emotions ran too high and to always come back to the discussion when they were calmer. Most importantly, they had learned to trust in the strength of their bond, to believe that their love could weather whatever storms might come. The fear that had once made them both cautious and defensive had been replaced by a quiet confidence in what they had built together. On the first anniversary of their reunion phone call, they had decided to recreate that evening, with David lying in bed thinking about Brian while Brian called him from across town. It had been silly and sentimental, but also deeply meaningful, a way of honoring the moment that had brought them back together. This time, when the phone rang, David had answered immediately, and they had both started laughing at the same time. The conversation had been lighter than that first desperate call, full of inside jokes and plans for the future rather than apologies and explanations. But the love in their voices had been just as strong, perhaps stronger for having been tested and proven resilient. Now, 2 years after that pivotal phone call, David often reflected on how much their understanding of love and relationships had evolved. They had learned that real love wasn't the dramatic, all-consuming passion depicted in movies and songs, but something quieter and more sustainable. It was the choice to be patient when your partner was stressed, to listen when they needed to talk, to give them space when they needed solitude. It was the willingness to be vulnerable, to admit when you were wrong, to ask for help when you needed it. It was the daily decision to prioritize your relationship even when other things seemed more urgent or exciting. Most of all, it was the recognition that love was not a feeling that happened to you, but an action you chose to take over and over again in countless small ways throughout each day. Brian had been right about making your own meaning, David realized. They hadn't been brought together by cosmic forces or universal design. They had found each other through a combination of chance and choice, had built their love through deliberate action and conscious commitment. But that didn't make their story any less magical or meaningful. If anything, it made it more so, because it was something they had created together, something that belonged entirely to them. On a warm evening in late spring, almost 3 years after their reunion, Brian proposed to David in the same park where they had first confessed their feelings for each other. It was simple and perfect, just the two of them, and a ring that Brian had designed himself, incorporating elements that represented both of their careers and their shared commitment to building a better world. David said yes before Brian had even finished asking the question, tears streaming down his face as he realized that this was really happening, that they were really going to spend their lives together in the most official and permanent way possible. The wedding planning that followed was a joyful chaos of decisions about flowers and food and music, but also deeper conversations about what marriage meant to them and how they wanted to structure their life together. They decided on a small ceremony with close family and friends, held in the botanical garden where Brian had done some of his graduate research. The ceremony itself was everything they had hoped for and more. David's sister served as his best woman, while Brian's younger brother stood up for him. The vows they had written were personal and specific, full of references to their journey together and promises about the future they wanted to build. When the officiant pronounced them married, the kiss they shared was tender and joyful, witnessed by everyone who mattered most to them. David felt a completeness in that moment that he had never experienced before, a sense that all the pieces of his life had finally fallen into place. The reception was held in the garden's greenhouse, surrounded by the plants and flowers that Brian loved so much. They danced to a song they had chosen together, one that spoke of choosing love over fear and building something lasting together. As they swayed together on the dance floor, David marveled at how far they had come from those two confused and frightened men who had almost let their fears destroy something beautiful. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and they were alone in their hotel room, they lay in bed talking about the day and what it meant to be married. It felt both momentous and natural, a formalization of what they had already been building together for years. "I love you, Mr. Foster Kelly," Brian said, using the hyphenated name they had chosen to represent their union. "I love you too, Mr. Foster Kelly," David replied, and they both laughed at the newness of it, the way it felt both strange and exactly right. As they settled into sleep on their first night as married men, David thought about the phone call that had started their reconciliation, about the perfect timing that had seemed so meaningful at the time. He understood now that the timing hadn't been the miracle. The miracle had been their willingness to be vulnerable with each other, to choose love over pride, to believe that what they had together was worth fighting for. They had created their own signs and their own meaning, had built a love story that was uniquely theirs. It wasn't a story about destiny or fate, but about two people who had chosen each other again and again, who had learned that the most profound connections were the ones you nurtured and protected through conscious choice and daily action. The phone had rung at exactly the right moment, but they had made it the right moment by being ready to answer, ready to be honest, ready to try again. That was the real magic, David thought as he drifted off to sleep beside his husband. Not that the universe had conspired to bring them together, but that they had conspired with each other to build something beautiful and lasting and true. In the end, maybe Brian had been right all along. Maybe they did make their own luck, create their own meaning, choose their own paths. But maybe that was the most romantic thing of all. The idea that love was something you built rather than something that happened to you. Something you chose rather than something you were chosen for. As David fell asleep on his wedding night, his hand intertwined with Brian's and their rings catching the moonlight streaming through the hotel window, he felt grateful for all of it. The coincidence that had brought them together, the choices that had kept them together, and the love that would carry them forward into whatever future they would create together. He no longer believed in signs in the way he once had, no longer looked for cosmic validation of his choices and feelings, but he believed in something better, something more powerful and more lasting. He believed in the choice to love, made new each day, and in the miracle of two people deciding to build a life together despite all the reasons they could find not to. The phone call had been just the beginning, the first note in a symphony they were still composing together. And David couldn't wait to see what music they would make in all the years to come.